Are we here?
We are not live yet.
Okay.
I'll welcome you. We'll introduce ourselves.
You are live.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It is Tuesday, February 4th. Those of you online are attending the House Committee on General and Housing. And our first witness this afternoon is Michael Goen, Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. And I think, Michael, what we'll do is we'll go around and the committee will introduce itself to you, since this is your first appearance with us. And then you can introduce yourself to us and take it away.
Great.
Thank you.
I can start. Rep. Emily Krabsnow, South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
Sadia Lamont, Lamoille, Washington District.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows and I represent Windsor One.
I'm Mary Howard and I represent Rutland City District 6.
Good afternoon, Gail Pezzo, Chittenden, Colchester.
Tom Charlton. I am representing Chester, Athens, Grafton, and Wingdon. Joe Parsons, Newbury, Thompson, and Groton.
Thank you.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax in Georgia.
Well, I'm Mark Mahaly and I represent Calais, Plainfield, and Marshfield. Welcome to the committee. State your name for the record and tell us what you can.
Sure. Michael Gaughan, I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. I'm also joined by my colleague, Nicole Lee, our Senior Financial Analyst. You may recognize her from Agency of Education previously, so we're very excited to have her. Someone that's familiar with this place.
You are lucky indeed. I happen to know. Nicole, do you think you will be participating in any way in the testimony? You might. If you might, why don't you state your name for the record as well?
Certainly, Nicole Lee, the Vermont Bond Bank.
Thank you. Please proceed. Do you have slides that you?
I do. Probably.
Generally, we have presenters share them.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Yep. Sorry. So I will. I do apologize. Have 1:30 at Senate Government Ops, so just be leaving promptly.
Happen on earth forever, right?
So as I'm loading this up here, I'll sort of give you the backstory on the bond bank, which I started with. I don't like to assume anybody knows us that well, although I used to say we're the best kept secret in the state. I think we're over that hump now. We have a decent amount of people that understand what we do, but for the last 50 years, we have facilitated infrastructure finance for Vermont communities. The genesis of the bond bank was that school districts were growing in the late 60s and had enrollment growth and were borrowing through local banks. Those local banks, different sort of regulatory environment, were hesitant to do the long-term financing for those projects. And so we had a bit of a capital crunch. So the solution was the Vermont Bond Bank. We have, you created us. We're an instrumentality of the state, like VHFA or VEDA. We have 5 board members, 4 are appointed by the governor, and this treasurer sits ex officio on our board. Our main program for the majority of our history has been a program we call our pooled loan program. And this is what we do is we pool loans together from all of your communities. We work with everyone. Burlington has their own credit rating. We work with them a little bit, but not as much as everyone else. And then we issue bonds that are sort of backed by those loans out in the municipal bond market. And then our bonds are credit enhanced from the state. And as a result, all of your communities get a AA+ rate, which on an S&P basis is equivalent to the state, and Moody's we're one notch off of what the state is. And so we don't risk, because of the credit enhancement, we don't differentiate the rate that we pass along to communities. So it's a great deal for your communities, your taxpayers, et cetera. And so we did that for a long time. In the late 90s, we started doing SRF activity, the State Revolving Loan Fund, clean water and drinking water. And that is part of the story we'll be talking about today. This is how it's an EPA capitalization grant. Historically, it's been 80% of the grant, and the state kicks in 20% that comes through the capital budget. For the bipartisan infrastructure law, the split was 90-10, but regardless, that money flows in. There's a pot of money for drinking water projects and clean water, stormwater projects. And in addition to the capitalization grants that come from the feds every year, there's also a recycling of loan repayments. And that provides the source of capitalization for those loans. Those loans are heavily subsidized. Sometimes they'll be partially forgiven. They all have a very low interest rate, sometimes no interest rate, depending upon the need in that community and different criteria from the ETA.
I'm going to interrupt by
Yeah.
just asking a question here and also slow you down. So am I right? I understand that like when you guys loan money, when you guys raise money for a municipality, like for example, Callis wants to.
Yes.
Bonds for a dam. Callis theoretically could issue bonds. But those bonds would, God knows how they'd be rated by the bond community because Callis doesn't have much of a credit rating. But right now, as I understand it, twice a year, you guys accumulate all the bond requests by the different communities. And then you issue one bond issue that is the credit rate enhancements so that we get all these towns get the benefit of the bonds. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, and then you proceed to transmit, you sell the bonds, you get all these millions of bucks. And then you proceed to give, Callis asked for $500,000, you give them $500,000 and they have a contractual obligation to repay you. And that obligation is backed by their full faith and credit?
Yeah, for 99% of our bonds are backed, are GO backed, general obligation backed, all ad valorem, taxing authority, full faith and credit. 1% or so are revenue bonds. Some of those are the small electric utilities in the state, and some of those are.
Are they more expensive for you?
Be honest with you, we have not financed a revenue bond through that program since I've been there. We've historically passed along the same rate. Those also benefit from our most powerful credit mechanism is the state intercept. So those bonds also benefit from the state intercept. Also included are not just electric utilities, but also Burlington's water and wastewater utilities.
So when you say general obligation, it just means that the voters, I'm going to use Callis as an example. So you've shipped $500,000 to Callis to do their dam, let's say, and they have a contractual obligation to pay you back. GO means general obligation that if they don't, the voters of Callis must tax themselves enough to pay you.
That's right.
Whereas a revenue bond would be different in that it's not backed by the full faith and credit of the town of Callis. If it was a utility, it would only be backed by the revenue that was supposedly going to be produced by the utility, which, theoretically is a little more risky. Is that right?
That's correct. But in both instances, we do have the like I said, we have this powerful credit enhancement mechanism that has never been used.
Okay.
We never intend to use, which is that if a community does not pay us, we can intercept dollars due to them in state aid.
Okay.
Which is similar to USDA or other federal programs, in which you might have a grant or a loan from the feds, and if you owe them money, they might take that off the top of what they're giving to you.
Right. And just to clarify again, in terms of the EPA, the drinking water grant, the drinking water funds, and stormwater, you guys essentially administer the loans made under these programs.
That's right. Under statute, we're the financial administrator. Through the Department of Environmental Conservation, the state does the programmatic review, underwriting, the sort of the intended use plan is sort of what the public document that can be reviewed and commented upon. The state produces that. And then once they get through their approvals, they come to us for financial review, financial capacity underwriting, and the loans are in fact in the bond bank's name, and we fund those and then manage the dollars that flow into the program in terms of investing those.
And
And
those flow in from the feds and the state.
that's right. Yep.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that for everyone. All right.
Yeah. And so then to round things out, so that was in the 90s. And that's sort of where we were up until very recently. And the issues that the state is dealing with have become more complex. The capacity challenges felt by municipalities are certainly more acute. And so starting, we've been sort of working on this for a while, but really starting last year, to be honest, there's a lot of wheels in motion for the last 3 years. But last year is where we sort of that's why Nicole's here. Because the volume of activity that we're undertaking increased significantly. So for one, we've always done fuel switching and energy efficiency types of projects through our pooled loan program, but we identified a very low cost of source of funds to do that through USDA, and have a loan agreement where we'll be now able to do those loans at 2% for 10 years, thanks to that program.
That's for,
Energy efficiency and renewable energy, and sort of used our expertise in capital markets, deal structuring, working with local communities to mold that to fit Vermont's needs. After the floods in 2024, we worked with the state treasurer's office to receive a loan from what was then the 10% of Vermont program. We're now part of the 2.5%, to make very low cost loans to communities recovering from the flooding. That was proven to be a very successful program. We made $15 million worth of loans initially, worked with Agency of Administration after 2024, did another $5 million of loans by essentially temporarily using the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, ERAF, and are going to do more lending under what we call the MCRF for 2024 response very shortly. And then Nicole is working very hard on some more climate resilience related programs where we, again, use our lending expertise, our expertise in managing money to hopefully identify some more federal funds through a program called Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund. And so the story here is that we are expert in working with municipalities, making loans, figuring out what their needs are, and then bringing together different sources of funding to match their needs. And I think that brings us to the present and the Vermont Infrastructure Sustainability Fund that was proposed by the governor.
you know what I'm going to do?
Yes.
Because I know you've only got 15 minutes. I'm just going to lay out for you
Yeah,
one reaction that we've heard, because it's a very interesting fund and we look forward to hearing it,
yeah,
is that it's just not enough money.
right.
And I'm just wondering, as you go along, can you accumulate other funds to the 9 million proposed
Yep.
to make it, more effective? But anyway, please proceed.
Read my mind. So why don't I just give you an actual case study and how this might work? So on page 4 of the presentation you have here, it was our pilot project for the energy loan program I talked about.
And share his-
Where do I plug in here?
Really open, I will give it to you again.
Oh, okay.
We're just having an announcement. Also, we're not supposed to do that technically.
when they do it, how do they share their screen without our having to?
Everyone that gets invited, I send the Zoom link to,
Right.
and then they share their screen.
They share their screen, okay, so as opposed to you putting the slides up and then having to play, keep changing the slides, all right. So you should be able to go, Michael, to the Zoom link.
If you are looking at page 4, you'll see there a great story in Charlotte. The town garage burned down.
There's nothing up.
I'm just loading right now.
Okay.
It's been a little bit of time. So burned down. Cost to rebuild was significant.
There we go.
If you share your screen.
Great.
Here's my hometown.
Okay, so there's the new garage. There's our event for it's sort of served as a pilot project for our larger program. But the total cost, including the PV solar on the project, was $3.2 million. So what, and then you see there that the town came up with a number of sources at the bottom for how they would fund this, but needed the bond bank's help for about $1.8 million or so of the total project costs. So some of that was structural. So we financed that through our pooled loan program that I mentioned that we've been using for the last 50 years. And then they have this PV element to it that qualified for this special program that we'd identified. And so made one loan for the majority of the project and then made another loan for this special application. And so therefore we're able to bring down the total project cost, provide them with the flexibility that they needed. And that was really because we have this understanding of the different sources that are out there and kind of can braid them together in a way that makes sense for that community. So fast forward to the Infrastructure Sustainability Fund. I have a similar idea for how this might work. $9.1 million, not a lot of money. We're always happy to receive more, should it prove to be successful. But here's how we were sort of thinking we would do this. We'll have the fund, and then we have kind of three ways in which we think we can deploy it. Number one is probably where your head goes, direct loans. Obviously, $9 million isn't a lot of money for revolving loans, but in many instances, we have small projects. The infrastructure needs are significant. Drinking water and transportation is where I think you had a presentation last week, but that's really where we think the majority of the need lies because the SRF program cannot finance drinking water expansion under the EPA rules. It's a repair and replacement program. So that drinking water expansion connecting to the main is part of the trick. Transportation, obviously as you dig up the road and build the community, that's going to be part of the need. So there will be instances in which that project is difficult. It's a small community, needs help, it's a very high touch need, right? And so a direct loan is probably going to be most appropriate for that community. But there will be other instances in which our pooled loan program would otherwise provide the right source of capitalization for that project. But the project, given that the community is trying to have that project sort of pay for its own infrastructure, the cost of even our low rate will be too high. And so in that instance, we would use some of the fund to bring down the cost through our pooled loan program, through kind of a supplementary loan that repays back into the corpus of the fund that is at 0% or something like that, so that we can take their rate from 4% to 3% and help make the numbers work.
Okay, I want to stop you there just to make sure I understand because I'm not sure I do. So a community has a small project. Drinking water, whatever, it's got a project. And so one thing you can do with the $9 million is just loan them money
Right.
at whatever interest rate. It would be your cost of capital plus, right?
Well, this would be, we would have no cost of capital, right? So it would just be about the sustainability of the fund to, in aggregate, hopefully grow with inflation.
Right. So it would be inflation plus a little. Okay.
Right.
But another possibility of using the $9 million would be to subsidize the cost of a loan which you made from other sources
Right.
by buying down the interest rate.
Right.
So if the source was your pooled loan program, what's the cost of capital for your pooled loan program is whatever the market tells you it is plus a little bit, right?
Right.
And so you could use the 9 million to buy down the interest rate.
That's right. So instead of, let's say, otherwise they would be borrowing $1 million from us. Instead, they would now borrow 900,000 in the pooled loan program, and we'd supplement that with 100,000 or whatever the number is from the sustainability fund. And then that money would recycle back into the corpus. And then the other way we think we could use this is as a flexible source of credit enhancement for potentially more sophisticated projects. So, I live in Burlington. I am on the planning commission there. We recently upzoned the South End Innovation District, which is by Hula. And that, that has elements that will be, that might qualify as transit-oriented development. And, there's a federal loan program. I don't want to go into all the weeds. There's a federal loan program called TIFIA that is very flexible as it pertains to transit-oriented development. But that program requires an investment grade rating to participate. The city may not have the ability to put its credit rating on the line. And how do we credit enhance that project to allow them to unlock other sources of financing? So that would be the third application of the fund.
Do you ever work with private capital where you underwrite the loan, or you provide credit enhancements, or you do things so that you're leveraging private money?
Well, almost everything we do is leverage private money. Our bond portfolio is about 650 million today, and we have a unrestricted reserves of about 24 million, or about a little over 4% of that total. The rest of that is through the sale of bonds to private entities all over the country. We've also done transactions in which we sell to local banks. So we did a transaction with Northfield Bank that was successful. And so you can certainly see an application where these developments are untested in some cases, and there might be some risk associated with that. And we help mitigate that risk, and then ultimately the bond or the loan is placed with the local bank that we help.
So, in other words, let's say we have a small project in a rural area and it's just nothing more than 8 units. And they go to Northfield, and Northfield says, no, we don't know you, you're too risky, or whatever. Or the infrastructure is too risky. That's what I'm talking about, the infrastructure in that town. They're just not going to do it. You, in some way, you assist the lending process.
Right. And I think I've advocated for it. I think this committee may consider at some point special assessment revenue bonds.
Right.
And certainly that is a useful mechanism, another tool in the toolbox so that infrastructure can pay its own way, the development can pay its own way. And if that's the case, your only credit support for that loan is that development itself. And so then it starts to become a little riskier than things that are backed by the general obligation. And so that's a great fit for a program like this, where you have certainty that you can pass the bond because it's those property owners, not the town vote. So that provides certainty for the developer, but it is a little bit higher risk. And so here's a more patient source of capital for that type of application. So that could be either a direct loan, or it might be some sort of credit enhancement if they're with their construction lender or whomever.
When you say credit enhancement, would you speak English for the committee?
Yeah, that could be, there's a number, I mean, I don't want to define exactly how that might work. That might be that we just use the sort of corpus of the fund. If there's a shortfall in paying back that loan, that might fulfill that missed payment.
A guarantee of some sort.
Guarantee.
Right.
Yes. And that might be full or partial. Yes.
You're sort of a green bank.
We are the original green bank. We think that term is unnecessary in some ways.
Says it's unnecessary. No, you don't have to do anything special. It's just,
That's right.
you've already got it.
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing wood pellet fuel conversion since the 90s. So certainly understand that.
Do you have any other thoughts about the infrastructure sustainability fund you want to share with us?
I think that covers it from now. Obviously, the sort of funnel in which we'd receive applications would be something to work closely with DHCD on and develop programmatic requirements around that. We have some experience doing that recently with a grant we received from DEC to do assistance for small water systems. So it's not something that's unfamiliar to us.
I would say, and I invite others to ask questions, I would say one of the impressions we have is that if we're really talking about rural Vermont, we're talking about very small projects and very, very small administrative capability, if any, to really go through complicated processes.
Yeah, and that is something, I mean, I guess I'm here to sort of say how great we are, but we have a lot of experience working with super small communities. Our SRF program, the SRF program in particular, the State Revolving Loan Fund, SRF, we're working with water districts sometimes that have 40 users in that system. And so we see municipalities from,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a good thing, okay?
No, I'm talking about my town.
Yeah, that's an entirely separate conversation, but we're working with everyone from them to the city of Burlington to the Vermont State College system. So there's sort of no scale that we don't understand, in other words.
One of the things, members of the committee have questions. One of the things that he did mention, which I just would like to tease out, since we have him with us for 2 more minutes, is you mentioned assessment districts. Right now, in an assessment district is essentially you draw a circle around a project, and then the property owners in that circle are assessed a certain amount each year. And that assessment is the basis for issuing bonds to build whatever it is that they were wanting to do, roads, schools, whatever it is that water districts or whatever, or for that matter, septic system. The property owners can assess themselves, pay for it, and it's spread out over 20 years, 30 years, the life of the bond.
Yeah, that'd be the theory. Right now that's allowed. It's just that you can't secure debt solely by that special assessment without going into all voters in a municipality.
So the problem, yes, Jeff.
I'm just trying to find a comparison. In my mind, what you're explaining sounds a lot. Basically a TIF district, but instead of a tax, you're agreeing to a loan
You're
payment.
not relying on the increment.
Right.
It's just.
You're not relying on a tax, you're relying on a
It doesn't
loan
have
payment.
special, and it's used
agreeing to
all
it.
over the United States.
Yeah.
You're putting in a road, what you do is you take the people who are affected, benefited. Some places it's called a benefit district. You draw a circle and you say, and these are the people that are gonna pay the bonds off. You issue the bonds to build the thing, whatever the thing is,
But the,
and then they pay those property owners when they get their tax bill. In addition to the other lines that are on everybody's tax bill, there's another line, which is your special assessment for the year.
okay, yeah,
And
okay.
very often in other jurisdictions, as I understand it, the vote to do it is a vote of the people who are going to be taxed. And that's the end of it. And in Vermont, it can be the whole town voting, so that the whole town gets to vote on whether some of them are taxed, which is what I think, Michael, you were saying is something we would have to work on.
That's right. But the term of art in the industry is land secured finance. Special assessment viewed the same way. Obviously, one is a little bit more beneficial than the other, but very similar mechanism.
Okay, and then as people move in and out of housing, that kind of,
It runs with the house.
I was gonna say, yeah, I could take a deed.
Yeah, it just
Yep.
runs with the house. Michael, thank you. Any other final questions? I have a feeling we might have you back.
Yes, I'm sorry if it's such an abbreviated time here, but thank you so much. Nice to see everyone. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you. CB, are you going to want to have both of you up there? Oh,
I can grab a chair.
grab a chair, yeah. It is, are we still live? No? Yeah. It is still Tuesday, February 4th. And we have heard from the Vermont Bank, and now we are going to get a little more deeply into the cost of housing and other related issues. And we're going to start with testimony from two representatives of the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and then also Kathy Byer from Evernorth. I think Gus and Holly, you know everyone on this committee. So I think that we should proceed immediately to your testimony. If you have slides, share your screen so that. By way of explanation to the committee members, this is sort of an ongoing effort to bring people in to talk to us about the cost of housing, what's involved with that cost in different kinds of housing, and what kind of contribution to that cost these agencies make in terms of how they finance it, how they put it together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please
for
take
having
it
us.
away.
So for the record, Gus Seeler, the Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board.
Polly Major, I'm the Policy Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board.
So to begin with, let me just start by saying thank you for having us back. And let me also say that cost and cost containment is always on our minds. And as we go through the presentation, see the various ways we thought about and tried to manage costs in a really difficult environment of the last 4 years of the pandemic. I think Representative Parsons, I recall you saying in a previous year that a bunch of the best people in your part of the world were very busy building very expensive housing. So labor shortage is a piece of what we're all trying to manage. The atmosphere in which we were working also, the legislature asked us to do a couple things. One was to go as fast as possible. And that was partially in response to the big increase in the use of the motel program and the big increases in homelessness we saw. This presentation also is going to focus on leverage and return on investment. And I will tell you that when you look at our enabling statute, it asks us to consider the ability to leverage the state's funds in order to get more for the taxpayers by bringing other dollars forward. There are dollars available that are only available for housing. They come in some very difficult ways. You heard from Mark Hollins about the tax credit. It's not the smoothest thing, but it's the biggest tool the federal government gives us to build and rehabilitate housing. So we try to make use of it. There's a variety of other resources that are not always available for things except by their location. For instance, there's something called the reinvestment tax credit, better known as the historic tax credit. And we always try to bring those dollars in when we're working on a historic building. It wouldn't be available for it. So we may build a more expensive building or rehabilitate a more expensive building in a downtown or a village center, but you couldn't transfer those dollars to a greenfield in order to get us a less expensive project. Same thing with the cleanup of an environmental mess. There's some kind of monies available from the Agency of Natural Resources or from the feds in order to get site cleaned up. You wouldn't get those dollars. So the price tag looks higher, but we try to leverage those dollars. I want to assure you that this keeps me up at night. Whether it's a project I want to do on my home or it's a project with the public's dollars. And you'll also hear that we work, and Kathy can speak to this more probably than we can, but we'll give you at least an example of how we value engineering. The chair asked me to just briefly review the role of the Housing and Conservation Board. So we are the primary administrators of what are either grants or long-term deferred loans from the state to build housing. And when we were created, the state spent nothing on housing back in the 80s. And we were really the beginning of the state intervening at a time that the federal government had really cut back its federal commitment to housing. So we work we are not revolving money right away, but we talked when we were in before about permanent affordability, and we are getting a long-term benefit for the public in return for it. We are not the only program, and there are other programs that try to provide other kinds of benefits like the VHIP program. So with that, I'm going to get into the slides as an overview and just begin to get this very first photograph is the transit center here in Montpelier. And it speaks to the kinds of things I was talking about. That first got funding from the feds because it was a polluted, contaminated site in the early 1990s. And when we finally took this project on, it was because DEW, a really good construction development company, had planned to build market rate housing above the transit center, and they couldn't make the numbers work. And so they pulled out of the project. The city of Montpelier was at the end of when they could keep the federal money, or they were going to turn it back for this 15 years in the planning. Maybe longer, because Governor Scott was actually at the groundbreaking for this. And so again, it's a cleanup of a polluted site and the bringing of public subsidy forward in order to bring the cost down to a place where people of modest means could afford the apartments.
You have a question? Go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I just want to comment that we took a tour of that building and the apartments
Yes.
a few years ago, and they were very nice.
Yeah,
Very
I mean, on
nice.
one side, you're looking at the river and
Mhm.
very nice apartments are looking at the Golden Dome.
Right, right,
So
yes.
it's a wonderful place. Some of the units in that building are for people up to 120% of median, or 100% of median, and some are for people who are very low income. We showed you this slide before, but wanted to bring it back to say we're doing a lot of different things, from shelter to rental to home ownership to mobile homes to farm worker housing, to accessibility improvements. And when you look at what we have committed for almost 5,000 families, the cost here, and there was a different slide you saw from a different presentation, is actually under $80,000 per unit, but they're not all the same kind of projects. And we'll talk about our most expensive projects. So we do a lot of different things, as I just said. And for the multifamily rental housing over the course of the pandemic, the median cost was around $330,000. Our investment was about $135,000. What you see here ranges again from permanent supportive housing on Main Street in Burlington. And I think this was one of the projects probably Laura Collins was maybe not naming, but describing to you. A really difficult site to get materials to move in and out of. But it was also a site that was free. And the reason it was free is because COTS already owned the building right that fronts on Main Street. So they had room and back to build another building. It was a difficult site to work in, also very well located for permanent supportive housing for families who had experienced homelessness, and some economy of scale at the service end of what they're trying to do because they're already on location there with a family shelter.
Gus, a question. So when you say since 2020, your average total development cost, that's all in?
For the rental part of it. Now, over the last year, the costs are higher than they were the first year of the
Right.
pandemic.
So the 330, which seems low in the sense compared now, it's because it's 4 years or almost, it's 4 years during which time the costs keep going up.
Right, and among the things we have done, which we'll speak to in a minute, is turning hotels into housing. First few hotels we bought, we got at great prices. The most recent hotels, much higher. Also different levels of leverage. So this chart really speaks to several things, and Polly, please add, but the first three projects are shelters where the state investment is most of the investment, which is to say to get a shelter up and running in Berlin, Vermont, because Washington County had very little shelter capacity, or the two field shelters up in St. Albans, there wasn't the ability to raise other money. You can't use tax credits for shelters. That's not allowed by the IRS. As you go across this, you'll see
It's hard for us to see the detail. The dark blue is
the dark
state funds.
The dark blue is our, so one of the stories you're seeing is when you get to the more expensive projects at the far end of the chart, you're seeing lots of the yellow, and the blue is, the light blue is other funding other than the state investment through us. So that's what, again, going to the question of leverage, are we bringing other dollars to the fore to help get these places built? That's what we're trying to do most of the time, because we needed the shelters so quickly, and because there was no time for a fundraising campaign with what was called CRF funding, which had to be spent within 9 months of when the state got it. We just said, we're going to pay the whole tab. And that's what happened there.
So just to add to what Gus is saying here, when we're talking about cost, we're really talking about two different things. We're talking about total development costs, so the full length of those bar graphs, what it really costs to get the materials, labor together to build these buildings.
Land, everything.
Land, everything.
Yeah.
The other thing we mean when we're talking about cost, and it's a very different number, is the cost to the state to get that asset. And so the cost to the state is that blue, the dark blue, the VHCD investment. The total project cost is that full line. And sometimes we can bring down the total project cost by increasing the state investment. And you can see there's different types of housing here, some of which, like hotel conversions in the middle, cost the state more, but cost less to create a unit of housing. And on the far right, net new units cost more to build, but cost the state less to get that
I'm
leverage.
having a little trouble, but in other words, these last couple of projects, you're talking about more than $500,000 a unit, right? Between 500,000 and 600,000 total
Yes.
development costs.
Yeah.
But most of that's being made up with private equity.
Right, I understand. And those, were they like historic preservation projects or other, were there costs driven up by being?
These three projects in particular were just new construction projects, but we'll show you some historic preservation projects.
But these were just straight new construction
Yeah.
at 600, between 500,000 and 600,000, well,
Yes.
for the last two, a unit, but of which a whole bunch came from, the cost of the state was much lower.
Right, yeah, because we're trying to get those other dollars to be put to work. So you saw a slide a week ago again in another presentation that said, and was accurate, 554,000 in public investment and other investment, but that's not what the state is paying. So the other thing we think about is what the return on investment is, to the community. So the Aubuchon, the French Block here in Montpelier, is a 19-unit development. And that space had been vacant since the 1940s. We had a similar story at the Key Corner in Bennington a couple of years ago with the Putnam Block, where it had been vacant since the 1970s. When we went up there with our lead paint team to measure lead contamination, it got the highest reading that it's capable of reading. It was a rabbit warren. To give you a thought about how to save some money, and my friends in historic preservation will be unhappy with me, but Mr. Chairman, you saw this project a year ago. They made us keep 3 internal staircases and glass them in. Their fire safety would never let you use these staircases as an exit again, but they loved the historic nature of those staircases. That changed the nature of the layout and we lost 3 units. So it made the project much more expensive because the basis went from 22 units down to like 19. So you should have a discussion with the historic preservation folks. You can blame me for having had it. They know that this is a pet peeve of mine, but that's one way we can make the cost of things go down. But for the community, just as with the transit center where there was a polluted site, getting people housed within a 5-minute walk of the supermarket, 6-minute walk of the library, a few minutes to the movie theater, to a great bookshop, a great coffee shop, and getting this back on the tax rolls was a big win. Same thing with the transit center. Big win for the community, even as it was very expensive. And again, here, lots of private equity. Just go back. Just one other point to make here. The largest source of dollars we're getting to make these deals work comes from tax credit equity, either the reinvestment tax credit known as the historic tax credit, which got used on a project like this, or the low-income housing tax credit. There is significant debt, and we also thought as we looked at the numbers that fundraising of $32 million by a variety of people was also a significant number. So those are some of the places funding is coming from to make these things work. A big part of what we've done over the last 4 years has been to make much more use of the 4% tax credit. And I think Maura talked to this last week, explained there's a 9% housing tax credit. It's about twice as valuable as a 4% credit. And therefore, this credit didn't get nearly as much use until the state had more money to unlock it. It's not like we can take these dollars and get investors to invest in things other than housing projects. So it is additional revenue to the state when we get them. It helped us invest in more than 1,000 apartments around the state. And actually, we hit more than 23 communities. Our database just prints out. Sometimes we have a multi-town project, just prints out the first community that it comes to. So we probably hit 25, 26 communities with this program just in the last 4 years. Who do we work with? These are all the organizations and entities that we work with. They are primarily nonprofits who do housing work, shelters for the home, or organizations that provide shelter for people who've been unhoused, but a variety of other kinds of groups all across the state, including groups like Summit Properties that was on the Channel 3 News, probably several other news channels about the big development that we're beginning with them in Middlebury. So we'll work with anybody who has a great idea and a good project.
Summit is a private developer,
Private developers.
and if that's not unique for you, I mean, do you work?
We'll talk more about nonprofits as we go through this. We are instructed by statute to work with nonprofits. They are the eligible applicants for our state funding. We generally provide federal funding to private nonprofits, and we'll talk more about that when we go through. But we've not turned down a good project since the pandemic began. That's been one of the beauties of this situation that we've been in. Who does the work on this? You can look at this another time, but lots and lots of small Vermont companies and some larger companies, including a big international company like Otis Elevator. What's driving cost? One of the things that drives cost is the availability of elevators and the labor to install them. So we'll talk in a bit about the project in St. Johnsbury, but the opening was delayed for more than 4 months because the elevator didn't arrive. And then when it did arrive, it needed to sit and wait for the labor. Kathy's shaking her head because she was the general partner on that project. And what did that mean to cost? It meant the construction loan, which should have closed in June, didn't close until October. And over the course of the pandemic, the cost of borrowing for construction went from 3% to 9%. So if you're doing a $15 million project, 9%, even for a year's time, 15 months' time is a lot of money. So those are some of the other factors that have been driving costs through the pandemic. We're usually often asked to fill a gap, a market failure. The building on the left is in downtown Bellows Falls, and what it was a concrete structure built, I think, in the 1920s, and it had not been used as a garage, I think, for quite a long time. The developers originally thought that they could reconstruct the building with the garage, and when they actually tested the cement, they found it was a cheaper kind of cement that they should not rebuild. So we saved the front facade. There's 27 beautiful apartments there today. Some look out at the canal there, and it really is the entrance into Bellows Falls. A project we're working on right now is the redevelopment of the old Bennington High School. And again, it's been vacant for 30 years. It is going to be used not just for 32 units of housing, 17 of which would be affordable. It's supposed to provide a child care center, space for the Y, and gyms, likely some performing arts in the auditorium, lots of community uses. The town of Bennington sees this as so essential that it's committed $3 million toward the renovation. The governor's proposed adding $1 million in its budget. Private developer working on this originally proposed this to us at about $440,000 a unit.
Which one,
High school.
the high school?
We got a budget a week ago that is well north of $600,000. We'll have to decide what to do with that.
Is I'm confused. The slide says public subsidy where the market can't function. Okay, so like, for example, in the Bellows Falls garage, why can't the private market
Well-
handle that?
Nobody took that site on or a couple of other sites that we've been involved in Bellows Falls over 30 years that I think you visited last summer, the old building that got converted to housing for artists, a single person had been living. Fundamentally, the numbers don't work. If a private developer could have taken that site and done something with it, I think they would have. Lots of people have thought about buying the Bennington High School over the 30 years. I know of at least 2 or 3 prior attempts, and when they looked at what it cost, they walked away. We're in the midst of a redevelopment at the Sacred Heart Complex in Newport, phase 1. It's going to add to the old convent building, but Russ Engels, who's a realtor, will tell you he said to us this morning when we were in the Ag Committee and the other body, I walked 4 different clients through that building and we all said, numbers don't work. I can't do this. It's way too risky.
So this, in this slide, the cost to build, you have the cost to build a new home in 2023 is $615,000.
Right. A new single family home in 2023, according to the finance agency, costs $615,000. And what we're saying to you is whenever we've looked at what it costs to build a single family home in Vermont, the cost of building multifamily rental housing is not far behind.
Why is that?
I think it probably goes to what the codes are, what the inspection requirements are. I think what somebody could do, like the fellows who worked on renovating the house I live in today, working out of the back of their pickup trucks could do, you can't do and get financed to build multifamily housing. That's going to cost millions of dollars. Your lenders and your investors simply have more requirements than somebody working out of the back of their pickup can manage.
If I can add here, what you're seeing in these 2 pictures is affordable housing developers taking on projects that the market could not take on because they didn't cash flow in a way that would generate return and a profit. Affordable housing developers are nonprofit developers. They're also for-profit developers. And we see the project type really driving the project cost, not the developer type. So we're seeing nonprofit and for-profit developers bringing us similarly priced projects.
So you work with for-profit developers in addition to nonprofit developers.
Yes.
The developer of the high school is a private for-profit entity. And again, they thought they could do it for much less. And as they've understood, environmental cleanup, flood mitigation, historic preservation, the costs have gone up more than $200,000 per unit. So they thought they could do it the way they were doing lots of other smaller projects, and they've found that it's far more difficult.
So I can talk a little bit about what are we seeing what are the cost drivers that we're seeing in the market today? And also I'll kind of go on to talk about how are developers working to contain these costs, knowing that we have one of the expert developers in the room, and Kathy, and so you're going to hear from Kathy after us. What do affordable housing developers do to leverage other sources to bring down that cost to the state, to create more housing, help the public dollar go further? And also, what can VHCB do to decrease the cost either to the state or the total project cost? So we're looking at what are the cost drivers. Some of the main ones that developers and builders point to are the hard costs, the labor, material, the investment needed to bring a building up to the state's energy codes. There's also the costs that are offset sometimes by those other incentives. So the historic requirements that you hear Gus talk so much about, and the site cleanup, those brownfield site cleanups. And then there's costs like time. Anytime a project is delayed because the permit delay or the permit timelines, construction delay, the amount of time it takes to compile the financing for that project. Because we're seeing hard costs escalate right now in this economy, that increases the total project cost. And we're also very cognizant that there are going to be future pressures on costs with potential tariffs, with something called the Build America, Buy America provision for federal funding as well.
Under the BABA, would that mean, tariffs aside, that materials that come from Canada would not?
I can talk about BABA later, but yes, there was a provision included in ARPA, I believe, that says that for building projects done with federal funds, they need to purchase whenever possible American materials. And so lumber is a classic example where the lumber is milled in Canada, and so we're not able to purchase the most cost-effective lumber at this point next to the border. We've seen rapid escalation in the costs of building supplies and labor. So red is labor, blue is building supplies. This is an older chart, but the point I wanted to leave you with here is that really rapid escalation we're seeing in the building industry since 2020. And this isn't just Vermont, and it's not just the United States, it's a global industry. So there are factors that are beyond control of the developers that we work with. So what are some things developers do to contain costs? An affordable housing developer has a very serious incentive to keep construction costs as low as possible while creating a quality home, because they're limited in the rents they can charge and how they can finance that construction. So like we said earlier, we see nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing developers having roughly aligned costs per unit, and we're seeing that align with what market prices are. All projects are competitively billed or have a procurement process. So we're looking to review the way the public dollars are being spent here to ensure that they're going to the highest value materials that are most efficient. And then these projects are also going through a process of value engineering, which is looking at the building design and the choices that are made in that design and saying, is there a way to maintain quality while using a more cost-effective material or making a more cost-effective design choice? And an example of that is Firehouse Apartments in Bristol here that was developed by Addison Housing Works, a nonprofit in partnership with Evernorth. And that went through several value engineering processes. And in the end of the day, it saved $300,000 in the total cost of the whole building. And some of the decisions, I just want to share some of the examples. Some of the decisions being made are whether to omit soundproofing in between stories. Really important for apartments, but it came at a cost of $40,000. And then they're also looking as small as changing the size of one of the water heaters and saving a little less than $2,000 on that decision. So this is really going through these projects with a fine-tooth comb to really decide how to make them most cost-effective and bring down that total project cost. And when you've designed as efficient building as possible and still have to find those funding sources, that's when we start and developers start looking at what sources can we leverage, can we bring into the state to offset the cost of housing.
And just before you leave this slide, this was a project that a fellow in Bristol, very attached to the community, worked on for probably a decade. He wanted to make it condominiums for sale. And when the cost hit something like $325 a unit, at that moment, he said, that's too risky. The market will not support home ownership at that time, at that price. And that's when the local nonprofit and Evernorth were invited in to replace them so that the community could still, having done all the planning work, get the 20 units built.
How much would a unit like that cost the tenant?
So the federal government, when you use tax credits, sets a maximum income and a maximum rent. And I can't speak to it exactly in Addison County today, but I'm gonna guess that a 2-bedroom might be 1,100 a month, something like that.
A little less,
A little less,
with
a one,
heat included.
with heat included, and a 1-bedroom less than that. So when we say you're limited as to your income,
Mhm.
you know, I could imagine in Bristol's market today, you could charge 1,800, 2,000 a month. And somebody would pay it, but not the same people who would otherwise get to live there and meet the tax.
Thank you.
So we've talked about buildings that are at the center and heart of communities that the private market hasn't found a way to redevelop in a way that's going to cash flow for them. And so affordable housing is able to step in and rehab those buildings and get them active on the grand list, contributing to the community. So here's 2 examples. Again, one new avenue done by a local nonprofit developer, Rural Edge, in partnership with Evernorth, and another that was developed by a for-profit developer, M&S Construction in Brattleboro. And these 2 buildings were able to be, the financing is able to come together in these 2 buildings because they were able to take advantage of very specific examples. In this case, New Avenue was able to take advantage of the historic and downtown tax credits, Flat Street of the historic tax credits. And so, when you take advantage of these tax credits, you have to meet the requirements of those tax credits. And that adds cost to the project, but that cost is offset by the equity brought in by these programs. So in the example of New Avenue in St. Johnsbury, it was a $14 million project, and $2 million of that came from the historic tax credit program and another $415,000 from the downtown tax credit program.
I want to go over this for a minute. So you're saying the tax credit is essentially free money, but for the project, it has a lot of requirements that drive up the project beyond what it might cost if it wasn't a tax credit deal. But the extra money that the tax credit throws into the project offsets, or more than offsets, that extra cost.
Usually it's offsetting when it isn't. In both these cases, going back to the question of return on investment and the story, as I understand it, in St. Johnsbury, you might correct me, the whole community decided this building needed to be turned around. So there's a different kind of return on investment beyond the financial. You had almost 10,000 square feet of commercial space that had been mostly vacant, right, for over close to 3 decades. So it was a drain on the downtown. So you're getting that kind of return as well. But yes, doing a historic building is usually more expensive. Complying with the Secretary of Interior standards adds cost, and that historic tax credit equity usually offsetting that additional cost. But the sticker price makes it much higher.
So when you say that a private developer was unable to, unassisted, was unable to make this work, it's because perhaps their costs might have been less. Perhaps, but maybe not. But in any case, they wouldn't have had the free money of the tax. They wouldn't have had the tax credit money. So with debt and equity only, it wouldn't have been possible. That's why they pulled out or didn't do it.
Well, in the Brattleboro case, that building had sat vacant for 30 years. So whoever looked at it, and this is like catty cornered from the wonderful food co-op in Brattleboro, great location, but I can't speak to why they couldn't make the numbers work, but they, this is the one on the right, building in Brattleboro was developed by, as Polly said, by a private developer. They initially thought their costs would be in the mid-4s. When they got done, they were in the mid-5s, a little above the mid-5s. So again, to the question of are for-profits or nonprofits, is one more cost-effective or not, really goes to building type, we think. And these projects tend to be very expensive.
Another type of incentive that gets utilized for these buildings is brownfield incentives that help to clean up polluted sites. And so that's a really important source for these downtown projects as well. And again, you have to meet certain requirements. That's bringing up the total project cost, but that cost to the state is less. And we're able to create these homes where otherwise buildings had often sat underutilized or vacant. I'm going to move on quickly through here for the sake of time and your questions. A place where we're seeing the incentives not keep pace with the cost to do the work is in the energy sector to exceed the state's building energy codes to fully electrified units. It's about 25,000, and Kathy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, with that in mind, in South Burlington, we have like an ordinance that has all new construction has to be energy efficient and certain codes. If that was something that was a statewide, would that really disadvantage development?
Well, what I can tell you is according to White and Burke at their conference, they had a presentation that said that the combined increased cost of labor in Vermont and energy codes was adding 15%
15.
to the cost of development.
Labor plus energy codes.
I think that was what the statement was. I was not at the conference. I saw the slides afterwards. What we can tell you is we would estimate not less than $25,000 in cost to meet energy codes in Vermont. And some of my staff think it's higher. And the contribution from various energy incentive programs is about 1% of total budget.
Oh wow.
So, when you were looking at the prior slides, we were running through, but for the 10th Cavalry, there was an environmental cleanup that contributed over $100,000 per unit to getting that development built.
Okay, so it would add substantially, because obviously retrofitting is more expensive, but we need to get units online.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need, what I would say to you is you should have a conversation with your committee on energy, because I think there's a whole conversation to be had
Yes.
about how the incentives work and how sometimes the solar incentives, somebody of my income can take advantage of, but we're not getting that same benefit for multifamily housing for people with modest means. So I think we have it kind of backwards in terms of where some of the incentives are.
I think that would be a helpful conversation. Thank you.
So some things that the HCB does to contain cost is, again, use the Vermont state dollars to seek additional resources, leverage those funds, help them build as many units as possible. And we've used that really effectively in the last 4 years with the 4% tax credit program that Maura Collins at VHFA administers. We also invest in a range of housing types, and I'm going to talk about how that is a way to help the state dollar go further and do housing that is less expensive than the new construction, which we need. And also work to collaborate with other funders and to minimize the regulatory requirements and compliance requirements. So the burden of accessing those funds is minimized. Not going to dwell on leverage because we've talked a lot about it, but we're always happy to answer questions. But this is one of those examples where, again, the state dollars, VHCB dollars are in blue, and then the tax credit is in orange. And sometimes we are increasing the state dollars in order to get orange dollars that otherwise wouldn't be available to the state. We're always looking for new models to bring affordable housing into the state's affordable housing portfolio. And so throughout VHCB's history, we've done hotel conversions. First one was Granville in the 90s, Gus. Rochester. But we've done about 14 hotel conversions over time, most of which have been done since 2020. And as we really increase the pace of these, in 2020, we saw them as very cost effective, and then the cost of hotels went up as they started getting used for hotels again. And that made it a less cost-effective strategy, but still one that when there is a good opportunity that a developer sees to convert a hotel into a lot of apartments, we saw that this Mountain Vale Apartments done by Twin Pines Housing Trust in Hartford. That's a more recent project. We're still seeing these come forward. They're great opportunities to bring a lot of units online quickly whenever possible.
Are you aware that the what is it, the Holiday Inn, Cortina Inn in Rutland Town is closed and is up for sale?
I heard they had a problem with health on that site, but yes, I've heard it's for sale. There were some big health concerns, but you may know more than I do.
Is it possible that the state might be interested in purchasing that hotel and building apartments?
I think we're always interested, and,
Okay.
and we would look carefully at that if that made sense.
It's a good spot.
It really is. I mean, there's, right there is a shopping center, there's buses, there's, there was a pool in there. I think it would be a good idea. Thank you.
We also work with manufactured housing whenever possible. So here's an example in the center picture, 7 highly energy efficient manufactured housing units going into a park in Bennington. And then we work to preserve affordable housing that already exists. And that can happen in 2 ways. The picture here, Dorset Commons, was housing built, operated through the private market that was affordable to the tenants, but was going up for sale. Champlain Housing Trust purchased it in order to keep it affordable to those tenants. There's also, in our statute, it asks us to prioritize preservation of affordable housing when that housing's been built with public dollars with a shorter term of affordability. So we require affordability forever. Many programs have a term of 5, 10, 30 years. And at the end of that time, tenants can face rent increases when the property flips to market rate. And so there's a urgent need at that point to preserve the property within the affordable housing portfolio to protect those tenants. And there's 4 properties on the market right now that there's an opportunity to protect those tenants if the affordable housing development community can purchase those properties into the affordable housing portfolio. And that's one of the uses that we could put the funding that you included in the BAA towards this year. It's a pretty timely issue. Simplifying your regulatory requirements, a long conversation, but one thing I want to point to here is that whenever possible, we work with other funding agencies to mitigate the compliance requirements that are going to be applied to a building. So Central and Main here in Windsor is one that received a CDBG award through the state, but that Build America, Buy America provision was going to apply to the building. And actually the cost of doing that was going to be more than the award itself. And so the Department of Housing and Community Development came to VHCD and said, could you use some of your general fund dollars to swap out our federal dollars so this building doesn't need to comply with Build America, Buy America? And that swap, while it increased what it costs to VHCB, decrease the total project cost, made it more affordable to build the building at the end of the day. Time is money, and projects often facing high escalation of building prices face a gap at the end. And so the HCB over the last 4 years has been able to increase project awards at the end to close a gap, and that gets units online faster. It means those projects don't have to find other financing, and it means that the homes can be built. So that's a tool that we've used to help speed up development, and in doing so, mitigate costs. I guess I'm going to turn this presentation back over to you at this point.
Thank you. This is one that you may recall when we were in South Burlington for the ribbon cutting. The developer said we had come up with, I think it was close to $2 million, because when they got their bids back and were ready to close, they had that size gap. This is a 94-unit development, again with a private developer, and it would have set the project back many, many months, and people wouldn't perhaps be living there if we hadn't been able to jump in. So
Are these in there to pull at my heartstrings?
they're all here to pull at somebody's heartstrings. But this also wouldn't have happened if South Burlington hadn't been inclusionary zoning. So it's a tool that we see as very effective. I'm going to talk for a moment about nonprofits. These are the nonprofits we've worked with across the state. If you went back to the founding of VHCB in the late 80s, there was no map like this. The Champlain Housing Trust was then the Burlington Community Land Trust with a staff of 1.5, and they've done 3 homes. Today, they support more than 3,000 homes, apartments, and including more than 600 homeowners. There was no Rural Edge working in the Northeast Kingdom. There was no organization working in Southern Vermont or Madison County. Really, we were instructed in our statute to invent a delivery system for a couple of different reasons. And 5 of these organizations, if you were a big fan of the HIP program, 5 of these organizations are the people who worked with the small mom and pop landlords to provide the loans and grants. So we invented the system so that every corner of the state would be covered. That's rare in a rural state. Go to Montana, if you go to any place where there's a lot of rural area, small towns get left behind. We have done, as you saw, as little as a 3-unit project in East Calais, down street from organization Central Vermont, didn't develop, but they helped manage. 7-unit development in Cabot. We've been in Broughton for a small project. So we get to small communities. Franklin, Vermont has a development, and this system was developed, these organizations developed specifically to get it out there. They also were developed as organizations that were committed to permanent affordability. And to go back to the question of return on investment, what I want to say to you is that the way real estate generally works is you develop a piece of real estate, you own it for a while, and then when the market is right, you flip it. And that's a fine model under American capitalism. But what it does for the people who live there is it means when the rents go way up because the property's been flipped, they need to find another place to live. So the decision about creating the Housing and Conservation Board and having a policy of permanent affordability was to not always have to be catching up and buying the resource over and over again. We do have to reinvest every 20, 30 years in the ways we all have to reinvest in our homes, but we don't have to buy the asset again. And so that is a big part of why this network exists across the state and why our statute directs us to support them. Policies for cost containment. You've heard me talk several times about cost of appeals, and I hope that's one of the things that you can work on this year. Density is a big help in doing development, but having more dense development without more public investment to support the dense development will mean that the affordable units won't get built. Something I want to talk about, it didn't stop on the slide in Windsor, but it took a good 12 months to get something called a corrective action plan approved for that site. I don't think you need legislation to fix that process, but I think I would encourage you and your colleagues in the other body to have a conversation with the Department of Environmental Conservation. In the case of the project I mentioned in Newport at the Sacred Heart Complex, I think it took them 18 months to work through the CAP process. So I'd love to see a process that where the time got down under 6 months. Because as you said, time is money for any developer. And I would also ask some questions about how much we're moving what's called, and Kathy's more expert on this, dirty dirt off-site into landfills, and whether that's the right thing, or whether I understand our standards are higher than EPA's standards are in Vermont. So I think that I don't want anybody to live on a contaminated site. So if we need to remove the dirt, we should keep doing it. It's above my pay grade to determine what the right health safety level is, but I think it's quite a discussion I hope you'll have with DEC. And then the availability of infrastructure absolutely makes a big difference to whether small communities can get access to resources. We've done some things without infrastructure, and it's not inexpensive. We did that in Groton, Vermont some years ago with a multi-building development spread through town. But it is more expensive, and the policies around maintaining a public drinking water, meeting the drinking water standards have gotten more intense and more expensive. So anything you can do for infrastructure is going to end up being a help. One thing I mentioned to the chair and to some others is that we've got a lot of money from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that did pass Congress, not the Inflation Reduction Act. That was so controversial. And that means that there's more money that's flowing into Vermont for another 4 or 5 years for water, sewer, roads, and sidewalks. I wonder whether it's possible to say, let's grab 15–20% of those dollars and use them exclusively for new neighborhoods that we need, like the one we were at in Middlebury yesterday. So those are some thoughts about how to help us contain costs. And then
On that slide, Gus, was a reference to energy strategies, and well, much of your presentation, you said that the subsidy more than offset the cost. With energy, you said, well, it doesn't.
It does not, no, we're getting.
Is there, aside from more money, as I remember, you have a special time-limited exemption?
Yes, so the renewable energy standard changed the ability of multifamily housing developers to utilize off-site net metering for solar, and changed it so they could only use on-site. And the challenge there is there's a lot of mechanicals that need to go on the roof of a multifamily building. So there's not enough space to generate the solar, the energy needs for the building with solar on the roof. Off-site is really critical to making solar work for multifamily. And as we electrify multifamily buildings, it's really critical that they have an energy generation component, because that makes the operational costs of the electric units cash flow better for the building. There is an exemption pushing that that bar against offsite net metering for multifamily out 1 year. And that is not, the rationale for 1 year is that that'd be 1 year to design an alternative incentive program. There isn't a clear picture of what that program would be. And so we think we need more time, at least till 2029, to really fully design a program that's going to allow multifamily buildings that are serving low and moderate income Vermonters to take advantage of solar the same way, as I said, a middle income household with their own home can do.
When does the current exemption run out?
At the end of this
January
year,
2026. Here.
The other thing I would say to you is that, and people might want to debate this, but the instruction from the Public Utilities Commission to Efficiency Vermont is to be cost effective. These projects can carry only so much debt, but if your test is around cost effectiveness as opposed to equity, that's problematic when you're trying to house a population where you are limited as to the income you can generate from the property. So I think that you may want to revisit that with your energy committee and with the Public Utilities Commission. I think Efficiency Vermont is up for a discussion about that. There was an adjustment some years ago for societal benefit, but if you just think about what it means for a low-income person to have their utilities included in the plant, now what it means to you as policymakers to have people not have to utilize the LIHEAP program to the extent that somebody who has to pay their own heating and electric bills, there is, I think, some significant benefit that the current cost effectiveness tests do not capture.
Is there a proceeding ongoing at this time to? Well, we can, Kathy is the expert. We can wait. I'll hold my question.
Right, I remember last year those discussions and learning more about it, so it's your recommendation that we revisit some of that, is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And last thing I'm just gonna say again on appeals is, this project in Putney was community developed a village center. They had a public process, debated it, was approved again in a public process, Regional Planning Commission, approved for a third time at the state level. And then they went through a permitting process to get design review and all the things you do to get your local permits. And yet we spent several years in court debating it. So I really like the idea that people should appeal the plans, but once the plans are set for this is where we want to build, we should stop fighting.
Do you happen to know whether in your experience, do the appeals come from people who are directly impacted or like adjacent property owners or something like that? Or do they come from just generally residents of the town?
They often come from people nearby. I think that's fair to say. And I guess but it comes at a high cost.
Sure.
To meeting the mission that you've given us. So we are seeing communities overall. The case in Putney, the community was quite strongly behind the project. The case in Woodstock, they actually had a vote of the school district to extend an easement, I think, for a water line. That spent 10 years in the courts. So I guess my question is, when have we had enough democracy? When have we had enough process? And if you have a concern about what's going to happen in your neighborhood, take it up when the planning is going on.
Right. I was gonna ask you while we have you, and I assume we are gonna get into appeals deeper, but what are your thoughts about a time when you get this amount of time and then that's it? This is how long the appeal is gonna be, and then it's over. Someone had suggested that to me recently.
Well, you heard from the administrative judge last year on this topic, and like most judges,
Have them back.
he thinks that all this should be in the judiciary, and he also told you why he didn't think time limits could be effective.
I had a constituent.
What I would say is to you is, once you go to court to settle a dispute, it's very expensive. And even if you limit the time,
Okay.
tell the judiciary that they have to get it done in a certain amount of time. I like the idea of an housing appeals board with a mandate. We use quasi judicial boards for the Human Services Agency, for the Public Utilities Commission. But I like even better the idea that your chair has shared with me of let's have the fights in the planning process, and let's keep moving once the plans are set.
I agree. Thank you.
So again, to the question of, high cost, I would love for costs to be lower. I'd love to build twice as much housing as we can build right now. But I guess I would just want to say to you that when you look at the high cost, look at the return on investment, not just from a financial perspective, though I think we've talked about the leverage and the need to unlock and bring that private equity to Vermont, but to downtown development, to rural development, to brownfield redevelopment, to getting new neighborhoods built, all of these things. I won't continue to read from them. And this, again, gives you what the leverage has been over this period of time since the pandemic began. And you provided a lot of funding for us, shows you the kind of leverage all over the state, and also speaks to what you heard most recently, the 10 most projects we've needed to put on average $152,000 a unit into, and it's had a cost of $551, but there's a lot of leverage in that. So not trying to hide the ball at all. It is too expensive. The only good news you would hear from somebody like Jeannie Morrissey, the owner of Jam Construction, is that who work hard with their hammers, with their saws, with electrical and plumbing, are making a much better living than they were some years ago. That's a good thing. But the average Vermonter, it costs too much. We are catalyzing new communities and new markets. And one of the things we've seen, that South Burlington established a city center. First two buildings were built as affordable housing. I think what you see, although these were built by nonprofits, is that it freed up getting them sold, let them then move on to, got their capital back out from what was invested in those sites so that they continue to build the neighborhood out. Same thing happened with a private developer up in Morrisville. This is a turnkey deal he did with the local nonprofit and Evernorth, and then that freed his capital up, and he built at least one, if not two more buildings in that neighborhood that were market rate. So we are seeing that your investment doesn't, we don't report to you on the numbers of market rate units, but they are happening because of our investment. St. Albans TIF District, we've invested in 150 homes. They've built 270 there. Rural communities. There was a local group called Cider serving the elderly across Grand Isle County. They looked for close to a decade, and they really ended up creating a village center in South Hero, adjacent to the community health center, right near the fire station. It's just a beautiful place that any of us would be happy if our parents ended up.
That was great.
And another thing you're getting is the protection of vulnerable Vermonters. And if you just think about this number of 1,450 people who are unhoused, who are living in motels at the cost during the height of the pandemic of $140 a night. One night was $203,000 that we were spending. 100 nights, much, much more. Even if you knock it down to $90 a night, which I think is probably around the current GA cost, you're still spending a huge amount of money every night. So we think that there's a cost benefit to getting people housed and a much higher quality of life, not just for the people housed, but for the community as a whole when they get housed. Again, you saw this before, but this policy of permanent affordability, we think protects Vermonters. The case in Burke, great old Section 8 project, we added 8 apartments. None of the elderly that were there needed to leave permanently. We're creating mixed income neighborhoods. What we see in the way of gentrification is without a policy like this. The rents just go up and the people of modest means can't live in a neighborhood like the one you see here. And we're protecting the assets. You don't have to buy the asset back again, as was the case with Northgate Apartments, protected in 1990 and still going strong, using, back then when we funded the project, we still had Ronald Reagan's Secretary of HUD, Jack Kemp, who believed in empowerment. This is a nonprofit with a majority of residents on the board, and they've taken good care of the property and are doing well with it. So with that, we're going to say thank you, and we're happy to keep answering questions.
Thank you so much.
I hope this was helpful to, I hope you walk away understanding that we are as worried about cost as you are. I wish I had a magic bullet for it, but I don't.
Thank you. Members of the committee, I sense it's time for a break.
I agree.
Kathy, are you able to go with us if we return here at 2:45? Members of the committee, it means we might go a little beyond 3:00. Magali, is there any problem with that in terms? No, okay. So is that all right? Are you available?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Forgive me